Hello and welcome to another creative coding video. Today we're going to do something a little bit different in that we're going to try and recreate the kind of look and feel of real paint, watercolor paint. What you can see on the screen is two blotches of colour which look like they've been made by watercolor paint. They're diluted a little bit around the edges. It's not a uniform block of colour. You can see the colours mixing a little bit as well, and there's a varying of intensity from the centre of the blobs outwards. And yes, it's not perfectly realistic, but it gives quite an interesting feel, and it's certainly very different from the very computer graphics looking, very geometric and perfect shapes. Now the field of kind of making computers create images that look very realistic in terms of watercolors or oil paints and brushstrokes and textures. It's quite a big field, and there's some very sophisticated and quite complicated techniques there. We're not going to do that here. Today we're just going to keep things simple and hopefully show you that you don't need lots of fancy ideas just to create something that is good enough, and I think rather impressive myself. So let's, as always, before you dive into coding, it's always good to think a little bit about what's our approach going to be, what's our plan, sketch the ideas out. So the idea that we're going to go with, and you'll have your own ideas as well and you should try them, but the idea we're going to try today is to try and layer very thin see-through shapes and just draw lots of them on top of each other so that they build up an intensity of colour. And clearly in the middle there will be a higher intensity of colour, but if we have these shapes that are irregularly shaped around the edge, it means that we'll have areas which overlap less and you'll have less intensity of colour. Let's draw that just so I can illustrate it. So if I have a blob like this, and then I draw another blob on top, and then another blob on top, and then another blob on top, and then another one, perhaps like this, you can see that in this region here, because these shapes will be drawn see-through, this will maybe only have a few layers, maybe even just one, so it'll be quite see-through, whereas in the middle we might have 6 or 7 or even 10 or 100 shapes to get through, and so the colour here will be a lot more intense, and hopefully that means the colour will be intense here, less intense around the middle, and quite light around the edge. So that's the strategy we're going to take. It might work, it might not, I hope it does. The other thing that we're going to do is think about how we design these shapes, and we're going to go back to what is now quite a common technique which we've used quite a lot in this series of videos. If you need a reminder of the mathematics behind it, do go back to the introductory videos that introduce it. So I'm just going to show you what the maths is here. So the idea is that if we take a circle like this, now if we want to move around the circle, say look at that point there, and we have moved around an angle A, what we want is what the x coordinate and the y coordinate of this point is, so that we can draw it. And the x is this radius here, radius times the cosine of the angle, and the vertical direction, y, that was x there, is the radius times the sine of the angle. Now this should be very familiar to us now, but if it's not, do go back. It's worth kind of becoming familiar with because we use it so often now. So this is going to be the basis of drawing a blob, but we don't want our blobs to be circles. We want them to be kind of more messy. So if I just change colour here, so what I'm going to do is, as we move around a circle, let's say maybe every 10 degrees or something, instead of drawing a point at the circle, we're going to jiggle it a little bit with a bit of a random value, so that we go out and in a little bit like this. So you'd have some kind of blobby splash like that. We've also seen earlier how we can construct these unusual shapes, because they're not squares, they're not circles, they're not triangles, they're shapes with many points. And previously we've done curves like this, and again, do go back to a previous video to kind of see how that's done. And the idea was to begin shape, and then with a loop identify each of these points and kind of use some code to mark them, and then call end shape, so that the shape can be drawn. So that's what we're going to do. We'll illustrate that, don't worry about it. But I'm just saying that we've done these things before, so there's nothing too new, and if you want to refer back to the earlier videos, it's good to kind of see how they were introduced. So that's the idea. So let's get cracking. Let's write some code just to draw a simple shape like that. So I'm logged into Open Processing as usual, and importantly I've got the Simple.js library enabled. So I'm using simple in the setup. So let's use a loop to count up the angles around the circle. So we'll say for var A for angle, if I can type brackets, starting at 0, going all the way around up to and including 360 degrees, which is a circle, and going up in steps of 10 degrees, say. And then, now that we've got the angle, we now need to calculate the x and y values. So let's just type that in because you can type as you think, as it were. So we want the x to be some radius times the cosine of the angle, and we want the y coordinate to be the radius times the sine of the angle. But what is the radius? Well, we could say the radius is constant, like this, and that would draw points around a circle, and we've done that many times, so we'll kind of skip past the very basics there, and we're going to add some randomness or noise to it. So let's use the noise function. So noise goes from 0 to 1, and we can say noise is based on A, the angle. If that goes from 0 to 1, we want it to be greater and less than, we want it to go from -1 to +1, so we can multiply by 2, take 1. That will take it to the range -1 to +1, but that's actually a small amount, so we'll scale it up by 50. And just as an experiment, we'll just draw some circles at those points. So the center of the canvas is 400 plus x, and then 300 minus y, so that we're centering our shape in the middle of the canvas. Oh, there should be a comma. And I forgot the radius of the diameter of the circle. Let's give it a size 10. That's just to see what kind of shape we'd get. There you go. So that's what we expected. We're going around a circle and we are perturbing that radius, jiggling it about to create a shape. Now we want that to be a filled shape rather than just, you know, point circles on the edge. So let's do a begin shape and end shape. And instead of a circle now, we need a vertex that tells it that these are the corners. There we go. We'll remove the diameter because that's not needed. So this is very similar to the previous video where we drew a curve that went through various points. This time we're just going to have straight lines, as it were. So let's see the effect of that. That should be a filled in shape. Yep, there you go. If I rerun it, it should be slightly different. So we can think of that as a bit of a splodge of paint. Now we need to think about making it see-through. Now I'm going to use the Hsb Color Mode because it's much more intuitive when thinking about colours. Again, do go back to the earlier video which introduced the Hsb Color Mode. It's a different way of thinking about colours. Rather than red, green, blue, RGB, we have hue, which is a colour, and saturation and brightness. So in setup, I'm going to do color mode, Hsb, and I'm going to say, let's say fill, 0 is red, saturation and brightness we'll say 80 out of 100, and let's say 0.5 in terms of the alpha value, the see-through value, the translucency. So that should make it slightly more see-through. You can't really see that it is see-through, so let's create an outer loop to make two shapes. So I'll create an outer loop here for var I equals 0, I is less than 2, I plus plus. So we're just having a loop around the drawing of the shape. Just indent that properly. So we now should be drawing two shapes overlapping each other, and hopefully they're see-through. Ooh, okay. So what's happened there is they've drawn it exactly on top of each other. That's because we were using noise, not randomness. So let's introduce an element of randomness just to perturb that noise a little bit. So we can call it a var random seed or something, var rs equals random, which will pick a random number between 0 and 2. Now previously we've used the word random number, which picks whole numbers. So that will pick a number between 1 and 2 inclusive. If I say random, then it picks a floating point, a number with fractions. So if I do this, it could pick 1.5, could be 0.7, 0.3, 1.99, and that's useful to us. So we'll take 1 from that to give it the range -1 to 1, and I'm going to just perturb that with a seed. So rs times, or add it. Let's try adding it. Let's see the effect that has now. That should jiggle the perimeter points a little bit more. Didn't quite do that. Let's make it bigger. Oh, that's better. So let's just explain what I did there. As we were using noise, that depends on noise, that depended on the angle. That noise function is useful because it looks random, but it isn't really, because it always gives you the same value for a given input A, the angle. So when we drew the second shape, going over the same angles, it produces the same noise value. We're using noise because it's better behaved than pure randomness. But if we're drawing the second shape, we do want it to be a little bit different. So we can just perturb this kind of seed, as it were, with some true randomness. Just knock it about a bit with genuine randomness. So that's why we're using random. So the second shape actually isn't exactly like the first. That's what we want. So this is the effect we want. We want the middle to be darker, to be more intense because it's overlapped, but around the edges there's more see-throughness because there are regions which only have one shape. What happens if we create, I don't know, 10 shapes? So there's 10 of these blobs now, and you can see again really rather intense in the middle and then kind of falling off. Let's get rid of the outlines. So we'll say no stroke, no stroke. That should get rid of the outlines. It's getting there, it's starting to look like a blob of watercolour paint. Let's make it more translucent, so thinner. So we make the alpha value not 0.5 but 0.01. It's quite thin. Okay, that's really rather thin, isn't it? Let's bring it back up a bit to 0.1. Okay, so that's better, that we're getting there. Not entirely realistic yet, but I've got a feeling that if we drew a bunch of these in a line, I think it would create a more of a smudged brushstrokey effect. So what I'm going to do is turn this into a function that we can call, giving it, you know, the location to draw it. Then we're going to draw it at various points. I'll illustrate what I mean. So the idea is, if we draw one of these kind of fuzzy edged blobby things here, and then draw it again here, following some kind of line or curve, we might hopefully get a sort of a brushstrokey effect. Let's try it as an experiment. So that to do that, we need to take the code that drew one of these multi-layered blobs and turn it into a function which we can pass the location x and y. So that's drawn there. We change colour to illustrate that. So one is drawn here, one is drawn here, one is drawn here, one is drawn here. So these are the kind of parameters that are passed to that function. So let's do that in code. So I'll take all of that code, cut it, and then I'll write a function. Function blob. I always seem to call these things blob. Let's pass it the colour as well, as in hue. Then x1, y1 for the location. So that's the code now in a function. I'm going to change the fill first parameter to be the hue that we've passed. And then the location will be x1 plus x and y1 minus y. Let's test that. We'll call it blob, just to test the function works. We'll call it with red first at 400, 300, and then we'll call it again with a different colour, let's say a blue colour, let's say 230. You can use the Hsb Color wheel to look at the colours if you're not familiar with them. And let's do that at 200, 200, just to check that works. Yep, so we've got a blob there and a blob there of two different colours. So that's good, that works. So let's now draw a line of these. So I'm going to use a little loop for var I, which is our counter, which goes from 200. You can find your own ways of, you know, covering a line or moving over a curve. It's entirely up to you. I is less than or equal to 400. I'm going to use that as the kind of XY coordinate. Let's go up in steps of 10. That means we're going to draw a blob, colour red, at X, which is going to be, if we say I times I, just II, just to test it. So you should draw it from 200, 200 all the way down to 400, 400 in steps of 10. Let's just test that works. It'll take a bit of time. Ooh, we've made some error there. So it's gone into a bit of it thinks there's I've written some bad code because it's taking a long time, so I'll add no protect at the top. That tells it that if some code is taking a long time, don't worry about it. No protect. Okay, have I actually made an error here? Yes, I have. There. Don't need that then. I actually did make an error. I wasn't incrementing that I. Let's try that again. There you go. So that's a bit of a line now. Let's reduce that translucency a bit again, because there's lots of them overlapping now. Yeah, that's good. That's rather impressive actually. I like that. That now looks a lot more like a little bit of a stroke or a dab of watercolour. So let's do that again with another colour. So let's copy that code, just paste it, and then change the second one, the colour, to be 230. And that's going to have to be at a slightly different location, so we'll shift it along 200 plus I. There you go. So you can see red and blue is now overlapping a little bit here to make a darker kind of purpley colour. And there's some funny effect here going on with kind of yellowing. I'll have to look into why that is. The last time I did look at it, I think it depends on which browser you're using, because they seem to mix colours either correctly or incorrectly, or just using a different model. But overall the effect is quite interesting, isn't it? It looks much more like two blobs of watery paint being mixed. Let me just refine the positions of those a little bit. I'm going to shift that one left a little bit, minus 100, and let me stretch it out a little bit further, so 1.25, just stretching the line out a little bit, and this one I'll also stretch out. Let's see the effect there. Okay, yeah, covering more of the canvas, less of an overlap. So I quite like that. Let's run it again just to see. Yeah, nice. Let's try a different colour. 230, let's say 120. Was that green, was it? Yeah. Very nice. So you can experiment yourselves. We'll stop there because we don't want the video to go on too long. But you can see how we've built up a kind of a watercolory blob using the idea of a perturbed shape, a blobby shape, with lots of layers of those shapes, which are very see-through, to create this kind of core component, which is more intense in colour in the middle and less around the edge. I think that's rather effective. And what you can do if you wanted is try more sophisticated shapes, perhaps. Perhaps you could try a blob which doesn't just have one shape but actually has perhaps two, a core one and an outer one. Or you could try, actually, instead of going down a line, you could actually make curves, because we introduced them last time. So you can have brushstrokes which follow a curved path to make them more realistic. But the core idea is what we wanted to cover today. So I'll leave that with you to kind of experiment with. I hope that I've shown you that although we're using computers and most of the kind of shapes are very geometric and kind of hard edged, you can try interesting ideas to give things a more realistic kind of painted watercolory feel. See you next time. Bye.